She asked me right there in the paint aisle on a Wednesday afternoon, holding a color swatch she wasn't even looking at. "Dean, can you be the father of my baby just for one day?" I'd known Claire Bennett for about 4 months. Long enough to know she took her coffee black with 1 sugar, but definitely not well enough for a question like that. I set down the box I was holding. "Only if you tell me why." 3 years before that moment, a doctor had sat me down in a cold little room and told me I was never going to be a father. My wife left 11 months later, and now a woman I barely knew was standing in my paint aisle, asking me to be a dad for a day. Here's the thing. She gave me 3 answers over the next year, each one truer than the last. But the realest one didn't come from her at all. It came from a 6-year-old sitting on a stool behind my register. Let me back up. My name is Dean Whitaker. I'm 34 and I own Whitaker Hardware on Main Street in a central Ohio town of 4,000 people. The kind of place where high school football scores get printed on the marquee outside the bank. My dad opened the store in 1986, and I grew up in it. I know where every single screw in that building lives. Dad died when I was 26 and left the whole place to me. He wasn't much of a talker, maybe 40 words a day, but he told me one thing over and over, and I didn't understand it until this story happened. Whenever a kid would come in with a broken bike, Dad would stop whatever he was doing every single time. It used to irritate me because we had a business to run. One day, I finally said something about it. He looked at me and said, "Dean, anybody can sell a man a hammer. Any fool with a cash register can do that." He nodded toward the door. "The job is being here. Same place, same hours, every day. So when somebody needs somebody, they know exactly where to find one." He went back to his shelving and added, "Showing up is the whole trade, son. Everything else is just inventory. Showing up is the whole trade." But something inside me shut off after that. I stopped dating, stopped trying. I opened the store at 7 o'clock and closed it at 6 o'clock, doing that 300 times a year, telling myself that was a life. A man alone in a building full of things other people needed. 34 years old. Never going to be anybody's dad. Everybody in town knew it because in a town like ours, everyone knows everything. That was me when the Bennetts walked in. Before I tell you what happened that Friday, if you believe that the family you're supposed to have doesn't always come the way you planned it, do me a favor and tap subscribe. This channel is full of stories just like this one, and I'd hate for you to miss the next one. Alright, back to the store. Charlie Bennett was 6, and he started showing up in September. His mom worked at the insurance office 2 doors down. School let out at 3:15, but the office didn't close until 5 o'clock. A gap every working single mother in America knows all too well. So Charlie sat in my store. The first day, he just stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was allowed in. He was small for 6, sporting a cowlick and sneakers with a hole starting at the toe. I asked him, "You lost?" He said, "My mom said to wait here." I said, "All right." He stood there for 20 minutes, refusing to sit or touch anything. The next day, I dragged an old stool out from the back. My dad's stool, the one he sat on for 30 years, and put it behind the register. I told him, "That's yours." The kid looked at that stool like I'd handed him a brand new car. By the second week, I gave him a coffee can full of mixed screws that someone had dumped out. A total mess. I set it in front of him with 3 jars and said, "Wood screws, sheet metal, drywall. Can you sort them?" He said, "I don't know how." I replied, "Neither did I. Somebody showed me, so now I'm showing you." It took 10 minutes to explain, and that kid sorted screws every single afternoon for 2 hours, dead serious, tongue out the side of his mouth like he was performing open-heart surgery. By the 3rd week, I made him a name badge using the machine we keep in the back for the staff. I punched one out that read Charlie, assistant manager, and clipped it to his shirt. I wish you could have seen what his face did. Nobody had ever given him a title before. He wore that badge to school every single day for a year, and Claire told me later that he even slept in it once. That's how it went for 4 months. The school bus, my store, the stool, the screws, the badge. He'd tell me about his day, and I'd hand him things. Dad's whole trade. I was just there. Same place, same hours. I never once thought of it as anything special. I just liked the kid. That was all. His mother, Claire, would come get him at 5 o'clock, apologizing every single day. Dean, I'm so sorry. He's got to be in your way. I'll figure something else out. I'd tell her, Claire, he's the only employee I've got who doesn't steal. That got me a laugh the first time I said it, and I thought about that laugh way more than I should have while driving home to my empty house. Claire Bennett was 32, with dark hair always up in a clip, and she was always moving. She had that specific look single mothers get, where they're running a war but smiling through it. She'd been alone with Charlie since he was 2. I never asked about the father. It wasn't my business, and it's just not my way. For months of that routine led right to the paint aisle. She came in on a Wednesday around 4 o'clock. Charlie was on his stool, but she didn't go to him. She came down the paint aisle to me instead, grabbed a swatch off the rack, and just held it. I could see her hands shaking when she asked the question. Only if you tell me why, I said. She let out a long breath. Charlie's school is doing a thing this Friday morning called Donuts with Dad. Man, I knew exactly what that was. If you didn't grow up with it, it's a real event American elementary schools do. Dads come in at 7:30 in the morning, sit at the tiny tables in the tiny chairs, eat a donut with their kid, and then go to work. I was that kid once. My dad had a store to open at 7 o'clock, and Donuts with Dad was at 7:30, but he came anyway both years. He closed the store, lost the morning, sat in a chair built for a first grader, and ate a donut with me. Showing up is the whole trade. He's the only one, Dean, Claire said, her voice dropping to nothing. There are 22 kids in that class. Every single one of them has somebody, a dad, a grandpa, an uncle, a stepdad, just somebody. And Charlie's got nobody. He has to sit there alone, and I just can't. She stopped, pressing the paint swatch to her mouth. I've got no father, no brother. My dad's gone. There's no man in that boy's life except. She trailed off again. Except me, I finished. She nodded, and that was answer number 1. I said yes. Obviously, I said yes, but I want to tell you what it felt like, because you can't see it from the outside. I'm a man who was told he'd never be a father. That's a sentence you carry with you. It sits on your chest at 3 o'clock in the morning. And then a woman walks down my paint aisle and asks me to be one for a morning. You know what I felt? Not sad, not weird. Just incredibly grateful. Like someone had handed me a glass of water when I hadn't even realized I'd been thirsty for 3 years. I'll close the store Friday at 7:30, I told her. Dean, you can't close the store. Claire, my dad closed the store. So Friday morning, I put on a clean shirt, sat in a chair built for a 6-year-old with my knees up around my ears, and ate a chocolate donut off a paper napkin. And that's where the second answer showed up, because about 4 minutes in, it hit me that something was unusual. The other kids knew about me. A kid at the next table looked over and asked, "Are you Charlie's dad from the hardware store?" I said, "I'm Dean." He replied, "Charlie says you have a machine that makes name tags." Then another kid chimed in, "Charlie says you let him use the box cutter," which I absolutely did not. Correction issued. But then a little girl said, "Charlie said his dad was going to come. He said it a bunch, but everybody said he was lying." I looked over at Charlie Bennett. He was 6 years old, wearing his name badge, sitting up so straight his back wasn't even touching the chair. his face absolutely glowing as he owned that room. And right then I got it. That kid hadn't been making up a fake dad or inventing an astronaut father the way kids sometimes do. For months, he'd been describing me. The store, the stool, the screws, the badge. Every single detail was true. He had just been using the wrong word for it. I got through that hour, though I don't remember much of it. Afterward, I walked out to the parking lot, sat in my truck, put both hands on the wheel, and cried harder than I did at my own father's funeral. Claire was waiting by her car and saw my face. "You knew," I said. She started crying too, right there in the elementary school parking lot at 8:15 in the morning. "His teacher called me back in October," she explained, wiping her face with her sleeve. She said she was worried because Charlie kept telling the class about his dad, and she knew there wasn't one. She thought he was dissociating or making things up. So I sat him down and asked him, and he told me all about his dad, and it was you, Dean. Every single word out of his mouth was you. I've known since October. I let it happen anyway because I couldn't stand to take it away from him, but I couldn't figure out how to tell you, and I've been so ashamed. That was the second answer. She hadn't picked me because I was the only man available. She picked me because a 6-year-old had already chosen me. Now, if you want to know what makes a small town, word travels fast. Charlie's actual father found out about the donut event by Sunday. His name was Trent, and he lived 2 towns over, just a 35-minute drive away. Keep that number in mind, 35 minutes. He had left when Charlie was 2, had a new wife and a new baby, and in 4 years he had never once driven those 35 minutes. But he drove them on Monday. He walked into my store at 4 o'clock in the afternoon like he owned the place. He was a big guy wearing sunglasses indoors on top of his head, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know. Charlie was on his stool, and I watched the kid's entire body go small. 6 years old, and he already knew how to make himself invisible. I said, "Charlie, go into the back and count the paint stirrers for me, will you?" He went right away. Good kid. Trent looked around the store, smiled, and said, "So you're the guy? You're playing house with my son." Then he did the exact thing people like that always do. He took the truth, stripped away everything that made it meaningful, and held up the ugly remains. "You know what this looks like, right?" he said, raising his voice on purpose so the 2 customers in the aisle could hear. A 34-year-old guy, no wife, no kids of his own. Can't have kids of his own, everyone in town knows it. Hanging around some little boy in the back of his store every day after school, making him a little badge, giving him a little job. You let that sit for a while. And now you're sitting in his school pretending to be his father in front of his class. He leaned heavily on my counter. "He's mine. You don't get to just take a kid because you couldn't make one." Every word he said was technically accurate. I don't have kids. I can't. A boy does sit in my store, and I did sit in that school chair. But his words had been completely hollowed out of the actual truth. That his mother works 2 doors down, that there's a gap between 3:15 and 5 o'clock, and that the boy just needed a safe place to be because nobody else was there. The truth was that this man had 35 minutes of highway in 4 years, and he never drove it once. My hands were shaking. I won't pretend they weren't, but I don't raise my voice. I never have. It's not a virtue, just how I'm built. So I kept it quiet. "Trent, how far is it from your house to here?" He blinked. "What? It's 35 minutes. I looked it up on Saturday," I said, putting my hands flat on the counter. "You've had 4 years and 35 minutes of road. You didn't drive it for his birthday. You didn't drive it last winter when he had pneumonia and his mom slept in a hospital chair for 3 nights straight. You've never driven it once." The store went dead quiet. "But you drove it today," I continued. 12 hours after you heard some hardware store guy ate a donut with him. I'll let that sit. You're not here for Charlie. You've never been here for Charlie. You're here because somebody else was, and you can't stand what that says about you. You don't want your son, Trent. You just want to not be the guy who abandoned him. And I'm sorry, but I can't help you with that. Nobody can. Only 35 minutes of road can, and you've had it the whole time. He didn't have a comeback. Guys like that never do when you speak the quiet truth instead of shouting a loud lie. He mumbled something about lawyers, but he never called one. He got back in his truck, drove his 35 minutes home, and has never come back since. To be honest, that's its own kind of tragedy, and I take absolutely zero pleasure in it. But here is what he did manage to do before he left. He put a crack in Claire. She completely came apart on my porch that night around 11 o'clock. He's right, Dean, she sobbed. That's what makes it so unbearable. He's right. People are talking. I've let my son build an entire father out of a man who's just being nice to him in a store. What happens when this ends? What happens when you meet someone, or you get tired of us, or you just realize we aren't yours? She was weeping openly. He's 6. He can't lose a dad twice. I did this. I let it happen because it was easier than telling him the harsh truth, and now I've set my kid up to get destroyed. It's all my fault. I could have said a lot of things right then, big, grand, romantic things. Instead, I told her the only true thing I had. Claire, my dad ran that store for 30 years. I sat down on the step next to her. He wasn't a talker, he wasn't affectionate, and honestly, he was a hard man. But he opened that door at 7 o'clock every single morning for 30 years. Every kid in this town knew that if they ever needed somebody, there was a man behind that counter. Same place, same hours. I looked at her. He told me the whole job was showing up. I used to think that was just him being cheap, like it was a low bar to clear. It's not a low bar. It's the only bar. That's what I know now. Trent is the boy's father, and he has 35 minutes of road. I'm nobody, and I have a stool. I turned fully to face her. I'm not going to promise you I'll always be here, because promises are cheap and a lot of men have made you empty ones. I'm just going to open the store door at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, and then again the day after that. She looked at me for a long time. You've been open at 7 o'clock for 4 months. Yeah, I said. I have. That was the moment it stopped being just about Charlie. I want to be completely honest with you about the year that followed, because I don't want to sell you a fairy tale. It was slow. It was awkward. We were both scared out of our minds. Claire had been abandoned. I had been abandoned. And neither of us was going to move fast. More importantly, neither of us was going to move at all as long as Charlie was standing in the middle of it. A kid isn't a reason to get together, and a kid isn't something you gamble with. So we did things the old-fashioned, careful, backward way. Just coffee for weeks. Then dinner at her place after Charlie went to bed, with her sister sitting in the living room. Then an actual movie in a theater like a couple of teenagers. There was one night in March that broke everything open. Charlie caught strep throat, and Claire had been awake for 2 nights straight. She called me at 10 o'clock at night, not to ask for help, because she'd never ask for anything, but just to hear a human voice. I drove right over with some soup from the diner and a bag of the orange popsicles her kid liked. When she opened the door, she looked utterly wrecked, hair everywhere, wearing the same sweatshirt from 2 days ago. You didn't have to do that, she muttered. I know, I said, and she just collapsed right there in the doorway, standing in her own house, crying like a person who hadn't been allowed to break down in 4 years. I didn't tell her everything was going to be okay. I don't do that. I just stood there and let the grief be as big as it needed to be. When she finally caught her breath, she wiped her face, laughed at herself and said, God, I'm sorry. I'm a lot. You're not a lot, I told her. Dean, I'm a single mom with a sick kid. no money, and a bitter ex. I am objectively a lot. I set the soup down on her counter. Claire, I own a hardware store in a town of 4,000 people. I've been alone for 3 years since a doctor told me I'd never have a family. You think you're a lot? I'm not a little. I'm just quiet about it. She stared at me. I'm not here because you're easy, I said. I'm here because it's 10 o'clock at night and you called. That was the first night I kissed her, in a kitchen at 10:30 p.m. We were both exhausted. The kid was coughing down the hall, and sleet was falling outside. 0 romance, 0 candles. It was the best 30 seconds of my life up to that point. She pulled back, rested her forehead against my chest, and whispered, I'm so scared of this. Yeah, I said. Me too. Don't be someone who leaves. Claire, I told her. I've never left anywhere in my life. That is my entire personality. It's actually a documented personality flaw. She laughed into my shirt. A wet, messy, beautiful laugh. Somewhere in that stretch of time, I stopped being just the guy from the store and became the guy she called first. Which brings me to answer number 3. It happened about a year later when Charlie was 7. We were all in my kitchen. Claire, me, and the kid at the table doing his homework. Claire and I were washing dishes, not touching, but standing close enough to know we were right there. Out of nowhere, without even looking up from his paper, Charlie asked, Mom, when are you going to marry Dean? Claire dropped a plate right into the sink. She sat down at the table and faced the conversation she'd been dreading for a year and a half. She explained everything to him gently, that Dean was her friend and he was wonderful, but he wasn't his real dad. His dad was Trent. She told him she was so sorry for letting him tell his class something that wasn't true, and that it was her fault, not his. She was crying, trying hard not to, doing that thing where you keep your voice steady while your face is a total disaster. Charlie looked at his mother like she was the absolute dumbest adult he had ever met. I know Trent's my dad, he said. Claire stopped. You know? I know, Charlie shrugged. I'm not a baby. Then honey, why did you tell everyone at school that Dean was your dad? He looked at her with total 7-year-old disgust, annoyed that he even had to explain it. Because you can pick. Claire softy said, Charlie, you can't just pick a dad. And that kid looked straight at me across the kitchen, pencil still in hand, and said, Why not? He had picked me first. I had to leave the room. I stood out in my own hallway with my hand over my mouth like I was hiding from someone, my entire life reorganizing itself around a single sentence from a 7-year-old. He hadn't been lying to his class. Not once, not ever. He'd been making a choice out loud, every day for months, to anyone who would listen. He had looked at a man who had nothing and no one, a man who'd been told he'd never be a father and who just opened a door at 7 o'clock every morning, and this 6-year-old boy had walked in, sat down on a stool, and chosen him. That was the third answer, and it didn't come from Claire at all. Claire and I got married the following fall in the backyard with about 40 people there. Her sister cried through the whole ceremony, and Charlie was my best man, looking dead serious in an 8-year-old clip-on tie. He took his job way more seriously than I usually take mine. The adoption went through the next spring. Trent signed the papers without a fight and didn't even show up to the hearing. I'd like to tell you I feel nothing toward that man, but I actually feel a lot. Mostly pity that he threw away the only thing I ever truly wanted, and he doesn't even realize what it cost him. Charlie is 12 now. He works in the store on Saturdays as an actual employee with an actual paycheck. To be honest, he's a pretty lazy sorter, and I'm probably going to fire him one of these days. Oh, one more thing. On the morning of the wedding, he came into my room and handed me something he'd made himself on the machine in the back. The letters were a little crooked, but he'd punched it out all on his own. Said, Dean Dad. I I still wear it every single day in the store. It's on my shirt right now. Whenever a customer asks about it, I just tell them my assistant manager made it for me. So here's what I've learned. She walked down my paint aisle and asked me to be a father for a single day, and I told her she had to tell me why. The first why was a school breakfast, sweet and well-intentioned, but nowhere near the real depth of it. The second why was that a boy had already been describing me to his classmates since October, calling me his dad. Truer still, but still not the whole picture. The real one, the ultimate why, goes back to what my father told me. The whole job is just showing up. Same place, same hours, every day, so that when someone needs somebody, they know exactly where to look. I used to think that way of living made me small. Just a guy stuck in a building who never went anywhere, who couldn't give his wife the one thing she wanted. A guy who got left behind. I had it entirely backward for 34 years. Trent Bennett could make a son. He did make one. But that's not the hard part. Biology is easy. Half the world can manage that. The hard part is being there at 3:15 every single afternoon with a stool, a jar of mixed screws, and no hidden agenda or personal gain. A doctor once told me I'd never be a father. He was right about the narrow medical fact he actually knew, but dead wrong about everything that actually matters. Because a 6-year-old kid walked into my store looking for a place to sit, looked around at a whole world full of men who could have been his, and picked the one who had never left. She asked me to be his father for one day, but he had already decided I was the guy way back in October. I was just the last one to find out. If someone has ever picked you, a kid, a stranger, anyone, at a point in your life when you felt like you weren't worth choosing, I'd really love to hear about it. Drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it never ceases to amaze me how far these stories travel. Someone wrote in last week from a night shift, saying they read the comments on their break just to feel like they had some company. If that's you tonight, I'm truly glad you're here. And be honest with me before you go. If a woman you barely knew had asked you that question in your own store, would you have said yes like I did? Or would you have said no, gone home, and never known the life you just turned down? There's no wrong answer here. There's just the one you have to live with. If the story spoke to you, do me a small favor and tap that like button so it can find the next person who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because I'm here every single week with a brand new story about the kinds of families that don't always show up the way you planned. Open the door at 7 o'clock. That's really all any of us can do.